world thinks, the computers are all going to crash. All the Baha'is are now adding this wonderful law in which we repeat the greatest name 95 times every day. And the House of Justice, that alone would have been a remarkable letter, don't you think? In the history of the human race, that would have been a remarkable letter. But the House of Justice added something very interesting at the end of that letter in 1999. They said that there are two kinds of devotion. There are two kinds of the devotional life. There are individual devotions, which are represented by the obligatory prayers and the 95 Allah, which is done individually, plus other individual prayer. And there's communal devotion, community devotion. And there are two different types of devotion. And they say the spiritual growth generated by individual devotion is reinforced by loving association among the friends in every locality, by worship as a community, and by service to the faith and to one's fellow human beings. Now, they say, of course, that the spiritual individual is in the laws of the Akdas about the obligatory prayer and the 95 Allah. They say the communal devotional law is in the Akdas through what they say the law of the Massacres, which appears in the Kitabi Akdas. So you say, okay, we've got two laws in the Akdas, one about individual devotion and one about communal devotion, but the communal devotion, we can't do anything about it yet because, we only have a few temples in the world, and so that's for the future. The House of Justice says, although the time has not come for the building of local Massacres Askars, the holding of regular meetings for worship open to all, and the involvement of Baha'i communities in projects of humanitarian service are expressions of this element of Baha'i life and a further step in the implementation of the law of God. So what are they saying here? They're saying that devotional gatherings, which they just began in 1996, are the Massacres Askar in this day and age. The very law, they said it's an implementation of this law. And suddenly I said, oh my gosh, the Massacres Askar is not the building. It's not the building. The Massacres Askar is the spirit of communal worship combined, they say, with service. Because that is the two things that make the Massacres. The service combined with communal worship is some new form of structure, and it's not the building. We always thought the Massacres was building, building, building. Now the House of Justice says, no, Massacres Askar is the attitude of communal worship combined with service. Now we should have known that the Massacres Askar was not the building, because in 1912, Abdu'l-Baha went to the northern suburbs of Chicago and put one rock on the ground, and he said, the temple is already built. Now, the architect said, you could have fooled me. You put one rock on the ground, okay? But Abdu'l-Baha understood that the temple was not the building. It was this spirit, this attitude of combining worship with service. Which means that every one of us can have a Massacres Askar today in our communities through devotional gatherings. Isn't that right? So this is a very interesting thing. So I thought, great. Now I understand devotion. These are not just happy little meetings. I'm driving to my meeting and there's going to be two other Baha'is there and we're going to read a few prayers. No, this is the beginning of the mightiest institution of the faith that for 1,000 years is going to have temples. We're the first ones to have the Massacres in the community. But then, in 2001, the Universal House of Justice sent us a message that just completely blew our minds. How many of you were Baha'is in 2001? So do you remember this message that came, the Redstone Message 2001? They said we had entered a new epoch, which I already told you. And they said there will be one feature of the fifth epoch. They said a feature of the fifth epoch will be the enrichment of the devotional life of the community through the raising up of national houses of worship. Okay? So this is exciting. They said the fifth epoch will have national houses of worship. In 2001 they said this. Now, I knew at that time, in 2001, that the fifth epoch was going to end in 1921. Okay, because every epoch so far has been about 20 years, and every epoch has always ended at an anniversary, 1944, 63. So 2021 was exactly 20 years, and it's the anniversary of passing Abdu'l-Baha. So I knew the fifth epoch was going to last for about 20 more years, and this was in 2001. So, they say a feature of the fifth epoch will be the raising up of national houses of worship. We've never had national houses of worship. Every house of worship that we had up to that time were what we called continental. the Mother Temple of Asia, the Mother Temple of America, and so on. Okay, so I'm thinking, where are we going to have these temples? I'm thinking to myself, okay, it's got to be London, Paris, Moscow. I'm thinking to myself, where are we going to Tokyo? Where are we going to have these? Hong Kong? Where are the Singapore maybe even? I'm thinking, where are we going to have these? And the House of Justice says, the scheduling of these projects will be determined by the Universal House of Justice. I said, oh, okay, so I don't get to pick them. The House is going to pick where these temples are going to be. But by what criteria are they going to pick? Because we have to have a temple in every city of the world. How are they going to pick these ones? They say will be determined by the House of Justice in relation to the advancement of the process of entry by troops. So now they're linking where temples will be built are wherever those places advance this process. The core activities, the junior youth, the children, the study circles, wherever they're in the service system, wherever they're most advanced, they're going to get temples. And suddenly now we realize from this message in 2001 that temples are like flowering on a plant. That flowering naturally occurs on any plant when it reaches a certain stage. It inevitably happens, and it will happen in Singapore, it will happen in every part of the world, but it will only happen if you get to a certain stage. And they're saying, get to that stage, get a temple. That's basically what they're saying in that time. They say when you reach that stage. And they say this development will unfold throughout successive stages of Abdu'l Baha's plan. So they basically say that in this fifth epoch, from 2001 to 2021, there will be building of temples. So because I was involved with the dedication of both the Samoan and the Indian temple, I know how long it takes temples to build. The Indians, it took more than 10 years. You know that, from the time that announced they built, I think it was a little more than 10 years. So I kept saying to myself, sooner or later they're going to announce temples. So 2002, I opened no temples. 2003, no temples. 2004, no temples. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 2010, there's still no temples. And I'm thinking, well, we better hurry up, because the House of Justice wasn't lying when they said that the fifth epoch was going to have it, and now we're coming up to the new 5-year plan. 2011 was only 10 years before, so definitely the 5-year plan that's announced in 2011 is going to have temples. That's what I thought. I was telling all my Baha'i friends, going to be temples, going to be temples because we got to be. So we get this message, December 28, 2010, announcing the next 5-year plan. You remember it? You remember how long it was? 24 pages long. Do you remember that message? Announcing the 5-year plan. I'm looking at 24. There's got to be a temple in there. They could squeeze a temple in 24 pages. So I get it. Reads, no temple, no temple, no temple, no temple. Whole 24. There's not a single mention of temples. I say the House of Justice promised in this epoch that there would be temples. So I say, no problem, don't worry. The Redstone Message is coming up. This was December, so in April, the Redstone Message will come. We get the Redstone Message 16 pages long. So I open the message. No temples. Now it's 10 years to go till the end of the thing. They had promised us 10 years earlier that there would be temples in this epoch. Not a temple to be mentioned. So I'm really scratching my head thinking about this. And I'm saying, well, did nobody reach the process of entry? Did nobody advance and so on? And so I wasn't quite sure. Then, finally, we get this message, 2012, just a year ago. Do you remember this Redstone Message, 2012? And it begins, very interestingly, it begins by mentioning that at Redstone 100 years earlier, because this was Redstone 2012, Redstone 1912, Abdu'l Baha put the rock on the ground to establish a master Palaskar. 100 years ago, right to the Redstone. Okay, so they announced that, and then they end their message by announcing temples in their time. I said, of course, the House of Justice was waiting for 100 years to the Redstone when Abdu'l Baha started a temple for them to start a temple. Don't you think that's a beautiful way? But nobody knew, and nobody saw it coming in the message, because it wasn't until the 8th and 9th paragraph of the 2012 message that they got it. And so they finally, this is the 8th, I'll read you the 8th paragraph, because we were all reading this and we were a little bit surprised. It said, in our Redstone message of 2001, we indicated that in countries where the process of entry by troops was sufficiently well advanced and conditions in national community were favorable, we would approve the establishment of houses of worship at the national level. Yes, we knew that. We said that in 2001. Okay, thank you very much. whose emergence would become a feature of the fifth epoch of the formative age. With exceeding joy, we now announce that national massacres are to be raised up in 2 countries, and they mention these 2 countries of Papua New Guinea and Congo. Who would have guessed those 2? Who would have guessed Papua New Guinea and Congo? Did you know that those 2 countries, anthropologically, are considered 2 of the most primitive on the face of the earth? Did you know that? Anthropologically, they have certain races that are the highlands of Papua New Guinea and all. So this is very interesting. Maybe those people have less baggage to get rid of or something, so that they can take to the Word of God. But this is not, in my opinion, if you were to say to me, these 2 countries are the first 2 national houses of worship in the whole 1,000-year dispensation of Baha'u'llah. Is that amazing that it gets to be those 2 countries? And so we should be rejoicing. And then the House of Justice continues to explain something about what the Mashgiach Askar is. They say one more step is possible. Okay, one more step? And then they explain what the Mashgiach Askar is. He says the Mashgiach Askar, one of the most vital institutions of the world, according to Ad Baha, weds 2 inseparable aspects of Baha'i life, worship and service. The bringing together of worship and service is when, it says the union of these 2 is reflected in the coherence that exists among in the plan that we're trying to carry out. That coherence is there. So they say that in certain communities where they've advanced so far, 5 more places, they can have local houses of worship. They didn't even mention local houses of worship in 2001. They have local, and then they announced the 5 places, and they are, of course, Battambang, Cambodia, which is not far from here, isn't that right? Bihar Sharif, India. So 2 in Asia. That's pretty good. Matunda Soy in Kenya, Norte del Cocoa in South America, Tana, Vanuatu. First thing I looked at, I said, hold on, those are decidedly either on the equator or the southern hemisphere. All of them, okay, except in India, right? That's very interesting, don't you think? Because I think, what percentage of the world lives in the northern hemisphere? I think it's 80 or 90%, it's quite hard. So why is it there? Secondly, it's decidedly dark-skinned. No Europeans. No, there's no North America. There's no Europe. What's going on here? Okay, the House of Justice is picking those. Would any of you have picked those 5 places? If I said to you before 2012, there are going to be 5 local houses of worship, who's going to pick Tana, Vanuatu? Who's going to pick Battambang, Cambodia? Not even the biggest city in Cambodia, right? You're not going to pick it. You should have been able to pick it. You know why? Because these areas have all been flourishing with the core activities, with the study circles, with the junior youth programs, with the outreach, with the social action programs. Everyone, and in fact, 4 out of those 5 were mentioned 5 years earlier in the report that the House of Justice gave to the International Convention. So we should have been able to predict it. But they couldn't predict it because I know a Baha'i, Tony Deemer, if any of you know him, he's on the NSA of Vanuatu. And he said they were reading the Redstone Message. They were reading, paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4. They got to the 8th paragraph and it's mentioned temples. And then it said, Tana Vanuatu. And he said he fell off his chair. Fell off his chair. Because the House of Justice did not consult or mention it to any of the NSAs before this message. They all found out exactly the same time you and I did. Now, that means 7 NSAs, there's 9 members. What's 9 times 7? 63. 63 bottoms were on the ground that night. On the ground. And he said he thought not even his grandchildren would ever be hearing that there would be a temple built in Tana. This tiny island, 10 miles wide, 20 miles long, it's a small island. You know, it's like several thousand miles off the coast of Australia. It's as remote as you can possibly be. 20,000 people on the island. That's the population of the island. They're going to be one of the first local Mashgiach Askars in the history of this revelation. Only because if you talk to the counselors and the board members, they are doing wondrous things with the junior youth and the programs. And it made me realize that we need to study what are these places doing that we're not doing, because we can also reach this flowering state. There will be a temple in Singapore, sooner or later. There will be a Mashgiach Askar. But how soon it will be completely dependent on how much we can advance this process. And we can first advance the spirit of service and devotion in our communities with our devotional activities. So we need to talk a little bit more about this. Right now, we have 7 standing temples in the world, and 8 are in construction. So we're more than doubling. Just in this one letter, they're more than doubling. So this is a great evolutionary step. And the reason it happened is because we are advancing the process of entry by truth. So I'm going to finish here now. Tonight, would you like me to continue, because I haven't finished with the 5-year plan, or would you like me to go on to the subject of personal transformation and talk about the 5-year plan? I didn't finish my 5-year plan, because it's too big. Or would you like me to go on to personal transformation? How many would... We can discuss it later. How many of you are going to stay for tonight? I'd like to continue with the 5-year plan or go on to that, because they're all important. Everything is important. So we can consult. But there are many other interesting features of the 5-year plan. We are living in a turning point in human history. A turning point, and we are called upon to play some kind of a part. So if some of you aren't able to come tonight, I'll just say one thing. The House of Justice lists in one letter a number of things that you can do to answer his call to fulfill the 5-year plan. There's not just one thing you can do. And did any of your youth go to the youth conference? Any youth here went to it? You went to it? Okay, where was it? In
Politics.
yeah, oh yeah, okay. The House of Justice said to the youth in that letter, July 1 of this year, they said that the youth are invited to decide what role they can play in the 5-year plan. And this is so nice, because there's many things you can do, and there are actually 6 different things that they identified in one of their letters that you can do. So you don't have to do them all, but you need to do something to play your part in the plan. And if you decide to play your part in the 5-year plan, you will assure your destiny on this plane, in the spiritual plane, and you will ensure the progress and growth of the human race. So you need to decide what you are going to do in relation to the plan. Find something in the 5-year plan that you can do to further this process. And so I'm just going to finish with this very simple story. It's a story about 2 people. One was quite wise and one was not so wise. So let's just say that the one that's not so wise, let's say his name is, I don't know, say Elango or something like that. Let's say that the wise person is named, say, Tom. So the 2 of them are talking to each other. And the one says to the other, says, if you had 2 luxury cars, 2 Rolls Royces, would you give one to God? And he says, yes, of course, if I had 2 Rolls Royces, well, sure, I would give one to God, no problem. It's good, that's very good. He says, well, what if you had 2 mansions, 2 palaces? Would you give one to God? And without hesitation, he says, yes, I would if I had 2 palaces, I'd surely give one to God. So that's good, that's good. He says, well, what if you had 2 goats? What if you had 2 goats? Would you give one to God? And he's thinking about it. He says, well, yeah, what if you had 2 goats? Would you give one to God? He says, let me think about that a little more. He says, I don't understand. If you had 2 Rolls Royces, you'd give one to God. If you had 2 palaces, you'd give one to God. Why do you have to think about this? And he says, well, because I have 2 goats. And you see, the thing is, Baha'u'llah is not asking you for what you don't have. He's not asking you for what you cannot give. He's not asking you for these things. So often we think, if only I had this or that, then I would serve the faith. If I only had this kind of money, I would serve the faith. If I only had this kind of time, if I only had these kind of resources, then I would serve the faith. If only, then I would. And we should not think that way. Should we think, what do I have that I can give, whatever it is? What do I have that can give? And that's what the House of Justice is saying in this message. You need to consider what it is you have that you can give. And don't worry about what you would have if you did have it, that you would give if you did. Okay, you understand? We don't need to think about that. This is all that you're called upon to do, to give whatever you have. And this is what we're called upon to do with the 5-year plan, to learn it, to study it, and see what it is we can give towards it. So we'll talk a little more about this tonight, or spiritual transformation. I'm happy to talk about them all. So thank you all very much.